So some of you might remember from my video on the ancient solitary reign that I talked a little bit about the animal xenofiction category. I called it a genre in that video, which was probably incorrect, but terminology can be kind of difficult to pin down sometimes, so who knows? Xenofiction refers to fiction that is told from the perspective of a non-human character, such as an alien, robot, mythological creature, or animal. And animal xenofiction, as you can probably guess, refers specifically to stories that are told from an animal's perspective, so think Black Beauty, Watership Down, or Redwall. If you're anything like me, i.e. a shameless, disgusting furry, then you're probably a fan of animal xenofiction stories, if not in literature, then in the form of animated TV shows, movies, or games. The appeal of these types of stories, if I'm being perfectly honest, is mostly aesthetic. What can I say? I was poorly socialized as a child and then became attached to cartoon characters as a replacement for genuine social relationships. Now it's too late and I've developed an irreversible affinity for furry animals. I need help. However, beyond just the aesthetic appeal, animal stories have some other great quirks to them that warrant checking some of them out. For example, by adopting a non-human perspective, you can drastically change the feeling of scale in a story. In Dragon Charm, which no, I will not stop banging on about, Graham Edwards tells a by-the-numbers fantasy adventure story, but with dragons as the main cast instead of humans. Dragons are typically used in fantasy as difficult challenges for human characters to overcome, and we tend to associate them with great power. So because it's dragons journeying across a vast world and overcoming difficult challenges, the story just naturally feels much bigger than a tale where humans are journeying across a vast world and overcoming great challenges. Moreover, the forces that threaten the world feel so much more overbearing when mighty dragons need to band together in order to overcome them. You can also scale in the opposite direction. Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim depicts mice and rats going on journeys and overcoming challenges, but the environments they travel through are small and mundane, like a farm and a laboratory. This really helps to hammer home the vulnerability and fragility of the rodent protagonists. You really feel like merely existing is a struggle for them when they fight to overcome great trials that a human would barely even register as a task. So there are many reasons to read and study animal stories outside of just the appeal of animal characters. A change in perspective this drastic can be tapped for a lot of weird and wonderful ways to tell interesting stories. If you happen to enjoy animal xenofiction, then an author I would highly recommend is Daniel P. Mannix, who, as I understand it, was a monster to his daughter, and also he wrote some books about the colonial slave trade that look really sketchy. I wanted to clear this up, but I can't really make any concrete comments on Mannix as a person because there's not a lot of easily accessible information about the man on the web, and even the New York Times made such a woeful effort to research the man that they apparently got his name wrong when they published his 1997 obituary. I can't say what kind of person Daniel P. Mannix was, or whether you, as the potential audience, should or shouldn't choose to separate him as a person from his work, given what information about him is out there. I just want to let you know that he maybe wasn't a good guy before I start talking about his animal stories. Now, the reason why I want to talk about his novels separated from him as a person is because I believe that they have some, not a lot, but some literary value beyond just being an entertaining read. So even if you believe that we ought not to consume or promote the works of artists if they happen to be unsavory people, I can understand and respect that position, but I still think there's value in talking about Mannix's novels, which is why I've made this video. Oh, and if anyone is interested, Mannix's daughter and granddaughter, Julie and Kathy, wrote a memoir detailing their side of the story that you can check out. There's a link to the Amazon store page for their book in the description. Daniel Pratt Mannix is most famous as the author of The Fox and the Hound, but my favorite of his works is The Killers, and he's also written some other animal stories including The Last Eagle and Troubled Waters. What makes D.P. Mannix's animal xenofiction stories worth looking at is his unwavering dedication to realism. Mannix had a very hands-on experience with animals and raised many of them on his grandparents' farm as a child. He continued caring for various exotic beasts through his adult years and used his observations of animal behavior as the basis for writing his animal stories. Now, I can't speak as to how scientifically accurate the novels are, but regardless, the stories maintain an authentic, realist style of storytelling to a degree beyond what is usually found in animal stories. Human beings tend to connect with things that have human characteristics, so most stories told from animal perspectives will anthropomorphize the animal characters to various degrees. That doesn't have to be as extreme as giving the animals clothes and standing them on two legs. It can be as simple as making them talk to each other using human language. In Black Beauty, the horses talk to each other in English dialogue, but can't communicate with humans or any other animals. If you consider the dialogue between the horses to be a metaphorical representation of how they would communicate to each other as horses, it's still nonetheless a form of anthropomorphization because it gives us, as the human audience, access to the horses' communication in clear, unambiguous language. It's also doubtful that horses would have a way of communicating many of the highly abstract concepts that humans are capable of with our language, so there's a lot of liberties taken with realism even when the animal dialogue is kept solely within a singular species. Funnily enough, the film adaptation of Black Beauty gets closer to realism than the novel by getting rid of the dialogue between the horses, but the story is still narrated in English by the horse protagonist, so it ends up giving a human voice to an animal character, which is still, in the end, a form of anthropomorphization. This isn't to say that the Black Beauty novel or film are bad because of this, just that they're not technically told in a realist style, even though nothing you could call unrealistic otherwise happens in the story. What makes D.P. Mannix unique is that his animal characters act like realistic animals. For one, they have no verbal dialogue, and their internal voices don't feature in the narration. In The Fox and the Hound, protagonists Copper the Hound and Todd the Fox never say a word, and they don't understand human language beyond what it's reasonable for a dog to understand. Copper recognizes his own name because his master refers to him as Copper, and he knows a handful of commands. But Todd doesn't think of himself as having a name at all. He's given the name Todd by a human who temporarily keeps him as a pet, but after he leaves and returns to the wild, it's never again implied that he thinks of himself as having a name at all. The narrator just continues to refer to him as Todd, both as shorthand and to prevent reader confusion in scenes with multiple foxes. The other animal characters, such as the two vixens Todd starts families with, Todd's offspring, and the rival males he has to compete with, are left unnamed because wild foxes don't name themselves, at least as far as humans know anyway. There's also heavy emphasis placed on smell perception, as the strongest sense of canines is smell rather than sight. All of this is in service to the realist style of D.P. Mannix's storytelling, which tries to minimize anthropomorphization of the characters as much as it can. Now, there's an argument to be made, and Mannix himself actually makes this argument in the author's notes, that it's impossible not to anthropomorphize the animals to at least some small degree, even if Mannix bases the behavior and characterization of the animals entirely on his observations of their actual behavior. Those observations have to be interpreted and then written into narrative form by a human being who will inevitably give a very human interpretation of that behavior. There are just far too many fundamental differences between the mind of a human and the mind of a fox for a human to write a completely 100% realistic fox character. I would argue that this doesn't actually matter because the term realism has a bunch of caveats attached to it anyway. If you've ever side-glanced at an entry-level philosophy textbook, then you probably already know some of them, like the ever-popular, "How do you know that what you believe is real?" But for the purposes of entertainment, realism only matters insofar as the audience can reasonably believe that the story could happen in real life exactly as it's shown or described by the text. Now, I'm no fox or hound, but as far as I know, the fox and the hound could be an approximately realistic depiction of foxes and hounds. So as a human being seeking entertainment, the story appears to me to be realistic enough for my enjoyment of the realist style. In The Killers, the protagonists White Hackle the fighting rooster and Ishmael the female Cooper's hawk are both named by the narrator. Their names are never referred to by any actual character within the story, and that can do your head in a bit, but in a good way. I really love novels that can play with the way that the narrator tells the story, and the narrator being the one to give names to the protagonists draws attention to the disparity between the human voice of the narrator and the non-humanity of the characters he's describing. It makes the story read sort of like a nature documentary. We're observing and interpreting the lives of these animals, but we're interpreting them in a way that makes their story appealing to us. The documentarian-style narrator is at times playful and overly illustrative with his prose, which is great because it helped me to suspend my disbelief to know that some of the flourishes the narrator gave to the animal characters that otherwise might run the risk of undermining the realism were perhaps meant to be exaggerations of the events. There's a lot of great and concise storytelling moxie in The Killers. The only animal character besides the two protagonists who gets a name is Whitehackle's father, also a game rooster, who is named Mortgage Lifter by his owner, which is great because it's a nice small way of giving the reader some insight into the weird and desperate man who named him that. There's a far larger cast of side characters in this novel as well, predominantly made up from the farm animals who share space with Whitehackle, and all of the relationships between these characters are kept wholly non-verbal. In my opinion, The Killers might not be the strongest of the books overall in terms of its themes and characters, but it's definitely the best told story of these examples. Of course, the one about birds is the one that happens to be my Why am I even fucking trying? I'm so predictable. Why I don't even fucking... The Last Eagle is unique amongst these stories because the others follow two protagonists each, whereas The Last Eagle only has one unnamed protagonist. It's still an enjoyable read, however, it definitely suffers from giving only one perspective. Having the contrast between the lives of wild and domesticated animals in The Fox and the Hound and The Killers definitely added some variety to the events of the other stories, whereas The Last Eagle is completely on the wild side of things. This uniformity isn't helped by the fact that it's also another novel that focuses on a predatory bird. The story of The Last Eagle ends up reading very similar to Ishmael's story in The Killers, and while I enjoyed it for what it was, when I was reading it I could only think of how I wanted a story about a different kind of animal. As much of a bird-obsessed freak as I am, I can only read so many high-flying dogfights and aerial hunts before I want a different perspective. What saves The Last Eagle is that its characters are probably the most well-realized as communicative social creatures. That seems weird to say since, you know, they're eagles, but within the eagles' families, you really get the sense that there are substantive social and emotional bonds that tie parents and children together, even if the same doesn't really hold true between the siblings. You can see the dynamics of the parents caring for and loving their children while they're young, tutoring them as they grow, and then resenting them and trying to kick them out of home when they're too old to be cared for constantly. And you can get to see this from both sides, first when the protagonist grows up and then when he's raising his own young. There are adventures and action pieces that take place as well to add some excitement, but the most interesting bit is definitely the social dynamics of the eagles, in my opinion. This was present in The Killers, but not to the same extent. By comparison, the protagonists of the other novels definitely feel closer to rational agents than the kinds of fully fleshed out characters that you'd expect from humans. The Last Eagle manages to give the animals the most amount of characterization of the books without sacrificing the realism. I'll touch on this later, but the rational agent style of character can actually be appealing in its own weird way. But if you're not into that though, The Last Eagle definitely has the strongest characters of the bunch. Troubled Waters stars two goldfish. The tale focuses on protagonists Buck, for all male goldfish are named Buck, apparently, and his mate Ro, whose name refers to, the underwater world is definitely a refreshing perspective after... it was definitely a welcome change of perspective after two stories in a row set mostly in the canopies. Out of these stories, Troubled Waters is the one that's most focused on a singular theme, that being environmentalism and human interference in natural environments. A good chunk of locations along the river are polluted by human industry, and suffocation ends up being a recurring symbol of the text. The other novels do have environmentalist themes, but they're usually there to support or complement other parts of the story. Troubled Waters explicitly wants you to think about environmentalism, and I occasionally found myself rolling my eyes and saying, okay, yeah, I get it. On the plus side, it makes for some very profound moments of intense danger when the protagonists find themselves being poisoned by the water or struggling to breathe, which really emphasizes that the strongest part of this story is the underwater perspective. Mannix takes full advantage of the setting and makes this novel monumentally different to his stories set on the ground and in the sky. Following the story through an aquatic environment actually feels like buoyancy, pressure, depth, and the direction and speed of the currents are controlling factors for how the protagonists can navigate their world. It's simultaneously freeing, in the sense that the fish have 3 axes of movement along which to swim freely, but also trapping, in the sense that they can't leave the water for more than a few minutes of spasming around at a time, or expend too much energy swimming against strong currents. It's definitely the most alien perspective these novels have to offer, which is what makes it a strong xenofiction story beyond anything else. I will say that Troubled Waters and The Last Eagle have the weakest structure in the traditional storytelling sense. There's not really a clear purpose or climax that either story is building up towards, and that can sometimes make them feel a bit meandering and directionless. The Fox and the Hound and The Killers are both stories of mortal rivalries between 2 characters, so even when they're dealing with the day-to-day lives of their protagonists, it's very clear that both of these stories are building up to a final confrontation between 2 rivals. Ultimately, the primary purpose of all of these stories is still to give readers the animals' perspectives and showcase their lives and ecosystems in a storytelling form. So it's not that The Last Eagle or Troubled Waters are bad in that respect. In fact, there's a case to be made that they're actually stronger in this particular quality. But nonetheless, having that clear, robust story structure really helps to keep the reader engaged, in my opinion. The best way that I can describe a D.P. Mannix animal xenofiction novel is that it's like reading a David Attenborough nature documentary. If you're the kind of person who can enjoy watching an informational show about wild animals, where the narrator gives the day-to-day activities of the animals some storytelling flair that you can be entertained by, even if you know that it's exaggerated and probably also a lie, thanks editors, then you'll likely really enjoy D.P. Mannix's animal novels. On that note, though, I should also mention that the novels don't shy away from the, less palatable aspects of the lives of animals. Due to the steadfast dedication to realism, there's stuff like Copper eating grass to force himself to throw up, Todd using urine to mark his territory, eagle babies murdering and eating their siblings to avoid starvation, and yes, there's some animal sex in these as well. Look, I ain't gonna play defense for that, but I will say that it's not meant to be enticing, and it's also not at the level where it's offensive. It's just kinda there as an explanation and interpretation of actual reproductive behaviors in animals. It's basically the part of the nature documentary where Attenborough would say something completely stupid like, "Unity is achieved." So I'd still recommend these novels in spite of this, but it's honestly perfectly understandable if you decide not to read them based entirely on that detail. Also, I don't know how I keep finding books with weird sex in them. I swear to God, I don't go looking for these. I just find them and I don't know why. And I'm recommending them now? What is wrong with me? Realistic, non-anthropomorphized animal characters have an interesting quirk to them from a storytelling perspective. They are completely not relatable, but personally, I think that's fantastic. There are plenty of stories out there, in fact, I'd say this is true of the majority of contemporary fiction, that try to pull the audience in through the relatability of their protagonists. And there are plenty of reviewers out there who will swear by relatability as the most important aspect of writing an engaging fictional character there is. Now, this is fine, if a little narrow-minded. Relatability is probably the most tenable way that you can get an audience to care about a story. I'll never speak ill of a story that succeeds at making me relate to the characters, but there are a lot of stories out there that attempt that, and in my opinion, the appeal of sympathizing with relatable characters can diminish if that becomes one of the most common ways that stories attempt to engage me as the audience. Sometimes I want a story to engage me with abstract ideas, or a resonant style, or, in the case of xenofiction stories, giving me an incredibly unusual perspective. Making the protagonists relatable to a human would actually undermine this appeal. It's not just that the protagonists are animals, but how those animals perceive and experience the world. There's something nihilistic and unsettling about reading from the perspective of speechless, rational agents whose psychological existence is firmly rooted in the pragmatic. The experience of the wild animals is immediate and intensely selfish. There's always food to gather, territory to defend, or a predator to escape, with only brief lapses where they can enjoy a moment of calm. They are still emotional characters, but because they live their lives on the edge of natural selection's incredibly sharp knife, those emotions end up being utilities to their survival and reproduction. This is more or less Emile Zola-style naturalist fiction. In nihilistic stories with human protagonists, meaninglessness is usually positioned as a response to idealistic ways of thinking. Humans start from the presumption that life has meaning, and we tend to deviate from that by raising the question of whether life has meaning and maybe coming to the conclusion that it doesn't through hopefully some form of reasoning. In D.P. Mannix's animal stories, you get the sense that the animals don't even begin to consider meaning as a concept, let alone whether their own lives are meaningful. The brutality of the wild is cleanly portrayed through an abundance of overwhelming death, and the animals fight against their own death and the deaths of their offspring just because that's how they know to behave. The world of the novels displays life as fleeting, perishable, and cold. There's no greater purpose or idealistic aspirations to be found in a D.P. Mannix animal story, and as such, the stories never feel like they owe you any sort of tidy resolution. This might seem totally backwards, but this style left me on the edge of my seat for the killers, because I legitimately couldn't predict what was going to happen. The blurb tells you going into the story that it concludes with a final battle between Whitehackle and Ishmael. The name of the final chapter on the contents page is The Last Fight, and even knowing that, I had legitimately no idea how it was going to resolve. Does one of them die? Do they both die? What happens afterwards? In a lot of fiction that builds up to a fight between two rival characters, it's easy to expect that the one portrayed as the most righteous, or the one who has placed greater emotional stakes in the conflict, is probably going to win. Usually that's the protagonist. Even if that character loses as a way to subvert audience expectations, this structure is pervasive enough that we, as the audience, can form these clear expectations in the first place as the story builds up tension. In The Killers, neither of the protagonists are righteous, and neither of them have high emotional stakes or character arcs that need to be resolved by the conflict. So I had no expectations for which way the fight was going to go. I ended up caring about both of the protagonists simply by virtue of having followed them for the entire story. So even though I couldn't sympathize with them or relate to them as characters, I was getting so excited to see how the final battle would resolve. Even though there weren't any emotional stakes to the fight, the brutality of the world that had been firmly reinforced since the beginning made me understand that one or both of them could die in this fight, but never tipped me off to who was expected to win. And that was enough to give the final conflict the weight of a fantastic climax. It's so interesting to me how a stylistic change to this type of story arc can reinvigorate my excitement for something as pervasive and common as a final one-on-one battle between two arch-enemies. This is why The Killers is my favorite of the novels, by the way. I have some general criticisms of D.P. Mannix's novels. For one, the actual word-by-word writing is incredibly sloppy. There are a lot of strange grammatical and syntax errors, as well as poor wording or repetitive wording, which leads me to believe that maybe the work wasn't properly edited. In fact, I tried a very cursory search for the name of an editor for Mannix's work and wasn't really able to find one. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the novels weren't edited by someone, even Mannix himself, but whoever did the job, they didn't do it very well. That's quite a shame, because I think a documentarian writing style for a literary animal story might be really appealing if it was handled with more skill. Also, this doesn't hurt any novel individually, but there are a lot of recycled ideas between each of the novels. Notably, The Fox and the Hound and The Killers share a lot of structural similarities due to them both being stories focused on an escalating rivalry between a domesticated animal and a wild animal. The Killers also shares a lot of its character and in-the-moment execution of its scenes with The Last Eagle, since both stories focus on birds as their main cast. You'll find a lot of high-flying scenes set in lofty places across both novels. Troubled Waters is probably the most unique of the stories, but it nonetheless still shares its style and some of its illustrative techniques with the others. Strong similarities between works by the same author doesn't exactly hurt any of the novels in isolation, and you might even not notice or care depending on what kind of reader you are. But if you've ever read more than one John Green novel and found yourself complaining that he just wrote the same story twice, then you'll understand understand where I'm coming from. So if you end up reading a Mannix novel and find that you enjoyed it, ask yourself if you would be happy to read another story that's very similar to it, and if not, feel free to stop with the one you chose. Now, I understand that these novels aren't for everyone, especially if you just find animal stories to not be to your tastes in the first place. But if what I've said in this video sounds interesting to you, then by all means, go and pick up a Daniel P. Mannix animal story. They're not the highest quality of writing, but they provide a very unique kind of storytelling that I think is very much worth at least checking out with an open mind. They are all out of print these days, but you can still find them online as ebooks, so I'll include links to the Amazon store pages in the description. Amazon isn't paying me to shill for them, by the way. I just never usually purchase ebooks, so I don't know any other storefronts. If you know of any other animal stories that commit to a realist style and you think are worth checking out, let me and everyone else know by leaving a comment. In the meantime, I make other videos about books, so check out those if you want more. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave a comment asking me why I didn't talk about the Disney adaptation of The Fox and the Hound, and thanks for watching.